Hi there, it's Dr. Gianna Reams. So last time we talked about the death of Krateros, and I talked about it in relation to the sources as an example of how sources have different stories to tell. And so this time I'm going to use the death of Hephaistion in order to do the same thing, to give you a different version. Now in Plutarch, Plutarch takes a rather exciting death. Poor Krateros essentially got knocked off his horse and trampled and died unrecognized. And Plutarch instead gives us this Aristeia, that this story of heroic deeds, or as best he can. And then Krateros is found on the field by Eumenes, who holds his hand as he dies and is weeping. And he gives him a Hollywood ending, to an event and a death that really wasn't all that spectacular. So it's like, I'm sorry, dude, you died in a bad way. I'm going to make it better. Now let's watch Plutarch do the opposite with Hephaistion and shade his death in a way that makes him look dumb or foolish or young. So we're going to begin with Arrian. And just as with the death of Krateros, we really have two kind of stories here. It's one event, and they're close enough. We know he died in battle, facing non-Macedonians, facing foreign troops who didn't recognize him, and that he fell off his horse and or he was speared and fell off his horse and died. It's the rest of it that Plutarch elaborates on. With the death of Hephaistion, however, we're actually looking at two different threads. Two different versions of how he died. Now, can you put them together? Yes, that's what a lot of people try to do. And I would say don't do that. I would caution against doing that, because when you do that, you lose the thread. You lose what each of these sources is doing a little bit different, or at least that there are two stories, and then maybe we should be paying attention to that. And what's the tale embedded in these two stories? So just a reminder, again, if you're new to the channel, then I would love it if you would like this video and subscribe, comment, whatever, helps the algorithm. So I did want to say that before we dive in. But let's begin, and I will preface it all by saying, again, we've got 5 main historians of Alexander. We've got a lot of other sources that comment on it. But the story of Hephaistion's death is really only found in 3. Why? Curtius has a gigantic lacuna, that is a hole or a lapse in the text that hits it, especially in Book 10. So if you ever get an version and low version of Curtius, will fill it in. It tells you what happened, usually in italics. Ignore that. That is a summary. We actually have no idea exactly what Curtius said in those missing places. So your versions, and I do recommend the one, John Yardley's, that will have a ... That's what you'll be seeing at the end of, I think it's 3, 4, and 1, 2. Anyway, there should be ... after these, and you'll see that 3 and 4 are really quite short, and that's because it's missing whole chunks of these, chapters of these book. The book 10 is gone. We just don't have it. So we don't pick up in book 10 again. We lose the thread before Hephaistion's death, and we don't pick up with it again until the death of Alexander. So we're missing a lot. Similarly, Justin is just too short. He says, Hephaistion died. And then he moves on and it says he doesn't have a lot to say about Hephaistion, and he tells you who he is. And his real point is that Alexander grieved in an unkingly way. That's the point. But he gives no details. All right, so let's focus on the 3 main historians that do. Mentions of his death in other sources are almost always focused on Alexander's reaction to it. That is his mourning. And that's a completely different topic. I don't want to go into that. I want to talk about how these sources tell us he died and what's the story inside that story. All right, so let's begin with Arrian. Arrian is, just a reminder, Arrian's primary sources appear to be Ptolemy and Aristobulus, he says, although he doesn't clarify here. And then he pulls things from other places where he usually says, and other sources say. So what he's telling us is at Ecbatana, which is the northern city capital of Persia that was the Median capital. So this is where they went in the summer, hot summer. He says, at Ecbatana, Alexander performed a sacrifice, as was his custom after successful ventures, and held competitions in athletics and the arts and drinking parties with his companions. At that point, Hephaistion fell ill. It is said, and he doesn't tell us who said it, that on the 7th day of his illness, the stadium was filled with spectators. Remember, this is athletic contests, and they're having these symposia in the evening, okay? Kind of like formal state dinners, if you will. So on that 7th day, the stadium is filled with spectators, as it was the day of the boys' athletic competition. When it was reported to Alexander that Hephaestion's condition was grave, he rushed to his friend's side, but found him no longer alive. A variety of accounts have been written about Alexander's grief. All writers agree that it was profound. As for Alexander's conduct on the occasion, this is important. Reports vary depending on whether the writer was well or ill disposed to Hephaestion or to Alexander himself. I'm not going to read you the whole account of all of the things, because then Arrian tells you all of this stuff, what's been recorded about it. But that's really significant that, Arrian's aware that it depends on if you like them or not. Okay. And there is an account that is lost that was on the death or funeral of Hephaestion and Alexander by Anabasis of Olynthus, which is highly negative, we can tell. And it's that sort of thing that Arrian is referring to. But I do want to make one other thing down here that says a little bit further down, others maintain that I'm going to skip that. Still others say that he hanged the doctor, Glaucius, because of a drug given by mistake. Okay? Or, so in other words, this is a different account, and this is important, or because Glaucius, though he himself had seen Hephaestion drinking heavily, had not intervened. Okay? So what Arrian has just told us is that Glaucius is executed. Okay? And why is what's disputed. Not his execution, but the reason for it. And given that he's talking about people who are predisposed well to Alexander Hephaestion or ill, probably has something to do with the reason. So the suggestion here is that some writers are saying that Glaucius is being executed for what you and I would call malpractice. He prescribed the wrong medicine. It didn't work. Okay. And we know from other places that Alexander is not a crazy person when it comes to medicine. He has some medical knowledge himself. He trusts his own Dr. Philip, who's not Hephaestion's doctor, clearly. So there may have been a reason. We don't know what it is, but there may have been a reason that Alexander decided Glaucius didn't know what he was doing. And then we get this second account that says, oh, it's not about the medicine at all. It's because Glaucius saw Hephaestion drinking heavily, presumably wine is the implication, and didn't stop him. Okay. Now, if you have a fever, obviously it makes you thirsty. So it's entirely possible that Hephaestion was drinking wine when he shouldn't have been. But again, I don't want to conflate these two things. So let's not do that. Okay. What we're looking at here that Arrian is alluding to is multiple accounts with different causes, both for apparently Hephaestion's death, as well as for, at least in this case, the death of the doctor. And I mentioned that one in particular because of the mention of drinking. All right. Now, we don't know what sources Arrian is using here, other than him saying at the beginning and other places it primarily leans on Ptolemy and Aristobulus, and presumably both of them did discuss it. So let's assume that the story of Hephaestion being sick from a fever, dying on the 7th day, hitting a crisis in medical terminology, and then it carrying him off things going badly, that's coming out of one of those two, maybe both of them. And we also see in his methodology, that is how Arrian works. Arrian tends to, if they disagree, he gives you both of them. So in this case, they may both be agreeing. So the reason that we're given this account and not the accounts you're about to hear might be because that is what both Aristobulus and Ptolemy said. And I think that's a good bet. So let's turn now to a very short one out of Diodorus. And it's useful here that to compare the two deaths, because we've got the same writers. We've got Arrian, we've got Diodorus, and we've got Plutarch. In Diodorus here, the actual account of Hephaestion's death is very brief. What Diodorus goes into, first he tells you a little bit about who Hephaestion is, and then what he really wants to talk about is the funeral. So the funeral, this big account of Hephaestion's funeral, that's out of Diodorus. I'm not going to read that. So he says that while they are here in Ecbatana in Media, he let the army rest in Ecbatana for quite a long time. While he was there, he put on a festival with theatrical competitions and held continuous symposia for his friends. Hephaestion drank to excess during these symposia, so much so that he fell ill and died. The grieving king gave Perdiccas the job of conveying the dead man's body to Babylon, where he intended to give him a spectacular funeral. And then he stops and he goes on with some other stuff, and he'll come back to the funeral later. But that's enough for us for here. This does not say that he is sick in advance. Okay, this says that he drank so much he got sick. So two very different things. Arrian's talking about a fever. Okay, Diodorus is talking about drinking himself to be sick. And again, I hear a lot of people say, oh, well, he was drinking so much because he had a fever. Stop. Don't do that. Don't conflate the sources. Can you? Yes. Should we? Absolutely not. Okay. So that is Diodorus. Let's then take a look at the last one, Plutarch, because Plutarch is using the same source that Diodorus is, and who's Diodorus using? Probably Clitarchus. This is where I wish we really did have Curtius, because both Diodorus and Curtius utilize Clitarchus quite a lot, and we might get a better sense of where the drinking story emerged. And that might also explain why Arrian doesn't talk about that story if it's coming out of Clitarchus, okay, because he doesn't trust Clitarchus. All right, so finally, the big one. And there's a lot more detail here. At Ecbatana in Media, and it's from the Alexander, okay. The story of the death of Krateros is not in the Alexander because Alexander's already dead. That's from the Eumenes. So it's a different life, okay. At Ecbatana in Media, as soon as he had dealt with matters that needed his urgent attention, he became involved once again with theatrical productions and public festivals, since 3,000 performers had arrived from Greece. That's a lot. Sometime around then, Hephaestion contracted a fever, but with the young man's impatience, he refused to submit to a strict regimen. As soon as the doctor Glaucus had left, doctor has a slightly different name, had left, he went to the theater and ate a morning meal of boiled chicken accompanied by a large cooler of wine, whereupon he was taken ill and died a short while after. Alexander went out of his mind with grief at his death. Okay. And again, then he goes into what Alexander did. But I wanted to put Plutarch last because you see Plutarch doing that. He's conflating two different stories to dramatize it. But it's not just to dramatize the death or even try to make these two different accounts agree that Hephaestion has got a fever and Hephaestion drank too much. These are the two different stories. Okay. But Plutarch's telling another story. He adds to this. He gives us details. These are not details Arrian includes. Okay. They're definitely not in Diodorus. Where are they coming from? Who knows? From another account, maybe out of Plutarch's own head, just as with the death of Krateros. And it has a message. Just as he does the Aristeia for Krateros to fix up his death, that's kind of ignoble. Here, it's the opposite. Okay, so Arrian has Hephaestion die of a fever. End of story. Okay, he got sick. He died. That happened. Diodorus gives the drinking story. Not any mention of a fever. He says he got sick from the drinking. Then Plutarch puts them together, and he goes on and he says that Hephaestion, who is a young man, doesn't listen to his doctor, runs off to the theater, and then orders an entire boiled chicken and this huge amount of wine, eats and drinks too much, falls ill and dies. Okay. Couple of points. One, Hephaestion is around 34. Okay, 33, 32, early 30s. That ain't really a young man. And he uses a word there in the Greek, pais, which is generally not applied to men over 30. Okay, it's an insult. Subtle one, but it's there. And then he gives all of these details that not just that he's ignoring his doctor, okay, but that, or not that the doctor orders bad medicine, but that he facilitates his own death by going against order. So it's not just, if Arrian suggests that one of these stories that is floating around about Hephaestion's death suggested that he drank too much and Glaucius didn't intervene. This one is like Glaucius told him and he ignored it. Okay, he ignored the advice. And he says, well, he was a young man, but it's not meant to be an excuse for it. It's meant to say, you dumbass. Okay, that's the message here. That Hephaestion died because of his own fault. Okay, not because he got sick, not because the doctor made a mistake, but because he went against doctor's orders and drank too much, ate the wrong thing anyway, and that it made him sick and that he died. Okay, so that's a different story. That is meant to tear down Hephaestion's reputation, not to revive it. Okay, and if we look at this, and I don't want to get into stuff that I'm going to do later in the book, but it's part of a general trend that we find in Plutarch, contrasting these two men, Krateros and Hephaestion. Hephaestion is Alexander too, the Alexandros, a friend of Alexander. Krateros is Basileus, the friend of the king. He's the good old Macedonian values, good old Greek values. That's really what Plutarch is interested in. None of this mixing and matching that Alexander's doing toward the end, orientalizing awful, horrible things. And that's some of what we're seeing in this that I want to point out. So this gives you an example of how our ancient sources tailor the stories they're getting from their sources when they want to present a message. Okay, and it's a message that they are telling, not necessarily the one that's in their sources. We don't have those sources. We can't see them. We don't know where these two various accounts came from. As I said, it's a good guess, but only a guess, that the story of Hephaestion drinking too much and that carrying him off is embedded in Clitarchus. And that has more to do with what we know about Diodorus. But we can't know for sure. And Arrian doesn't tell us exactly who his sources are. But again, what we know about Arrian suggests that the story of Hephaestion dying of a fever is probably coming out of Ptolemy or Aristobulus and or both of them. So there's two traditions about Hephaestion's death. One, he died of a fever. The other, that he drank too much. Did these two meet in the middle? Plutarch tries to make that happen. But I would say let's not do that. Okay, let's be cautious here and recognize two different story threads that may not intersect at all, and we should let them stay that way. Okay, so always think about your sources and what the sources are doing and how they're using their sources as well.